Sometimes the people we push away are the very people our hearts need the most. In the complex world of avoidant attachment, rejection is not always a sign of indifference. It is often a reflection of fear. Many avoidants walk away from empathic, loving individuals only to realize later that what they rejected was the connection they had been searching for all along. Today, we'll explore why avoidants often fall in love with the empath they once let go, and what this reveals about fear, healing, and the power of genuine human connection. One of the greatest misunderstandings about avoidant individuals is the belief that they do not desire closeness. On the surface, they may appear independent, distant, or emotionally self-sufficient. They often convince themselves and others that they do not need deep emotional bonds to feel complete. Yet beneath that carefully constructed exterior lies a human heart with the same fundamental need for love, understanding, and connection that exists in all of us. The difference is that while many people move toward connection, avoidants often move away from it, especially when it begins to feel real. This is where the empath enters the story. Empaths possess a unique ability to make people feel seen, heard, and understood. They listen without judgment, care without conditions, and offer emotional warmth in a world that can often feel cold and demanding. To an avoidant, this kind of presence can be both comforting and unsettling at the same time. It provides exactly what they secretly crave, yet it also threatens the emotional walls they have spent years building. Many avoidants develop a deep fear of vulnerability. Whether through past disappointments, emotional neglect, or painful experiences, they learn to associate closeness with risk. As a result, they protect themselves by maintaining distance. But when an empath enters their life, something unexpected happens. The empath creates a sense of safety that allows hidden emotions to surface. For perhaps the first time in a long time, the avoidant feels understood without having to perform, explain, or defend themselves. This experience can be powerful because it touches a need that has existed beneath the surface for years. The avoidant may not openly admit it, but they appreciate the patience, compassion, and emotional stability the empath brings. They are drawn to the very qualities they often struggle to express themselves. The empath becomes a source of comfort, acceptance, and genuine connection. Yet this attraction can create an internal conflict. The closer the empath gets, the more the avoidant feels exposed. They want the connection, but they fear what it requires. They long for intimacy, yet they worry about losing control or becoming dependent. This tension often explains why avoidants can seem confused or inconsistent in relationships. The truth is that the empath offers something deeply valuable, a glimpse of the connection the avoidant has always wanted, but has been afraid to fully embrace. Sometimes, the heart recognizes what it needs long before the mind is ready to accept it. When an avoidant rejects someone, many people assume it is because the feelings were never strong enough. They believe that if the connection truly mattered, the avoidant would have stayed, committed, and fought for the relationship. But the reality is often far more complicated. In many cases, the rejection is not driven by a lack of love or attraction. It is driven by fear. A fear so powerful that it convinces a person to walk away from the very thing they desire. For avoidants, emotional intimacy can feel overwhelming. As relationships deepen, they begin to encounter emotions that are difficult to manage. The more they care about someone, the more vulnerable they become. And vulnerability can feel dangerous to a person who has spent years protecting themselves from emotional pain. Instead of experiencing closeness as safety, they may experience it as a threat. This fear often operates beneath conscious awareness. The avoidant may not even realize why they suddenly feel uncomfortable in a relationship that once brought them happiness. They may start focusing on their partner's flaws, questioning the relationship, or convincing themselves that something is missing. What appears to be a loss of interest is often a defense mechanism designed to create emotional distance. The empath frequently becomes the target of this defensive response because they naturally encourage emotional closeness. Their openness, compassion, and willingness to connect can unintentionally activate the avoidant's deepest fears. The avoidant begins to sense that the relationship is becoming serious, and instead of leaning into that connection, they instinctively pull away. Not because they do not care, but because caring has become frightening. In some cases, the avoidant believes that leaving first will protect them from future hurt. They fear disappointment, rejection, dependency, or the possibility of losing someone they have come to value. By creating distance, they regain a sense of control. Unfortunately, this temporary relief often comes at the cost of a meaningful relationship. What makes this situation so tragic is that the empath may interpret the rejection as proof that they were not enough. They may question their worth, their efforts, or the authenticity of the connection. But often, the rejection says more about the avoidant's internal struggle than it does about the empath's value. The important lesson is that feelings and fear can exist at the same time. An avoidant may genuinely care for someone while simultaneously feeling terrified of the emotional risks that come with love. Sometimes the strongest feelings are not the ones that bring people closer. Sometimes they are the very feelings that cause people to run. One of the most surprising aspects of avoidant psychology is that understanding often arrives after separation. While a relationship is active, an avoidant may be so focused on protecting their independence and managing their discomfort with intimacy that they fail to fully recognize the value of the person standing right in front of them. Their attention becomes centered on creating space, reducing emotional pressure, or escaping feelings that seem overwhelming. In that state, it can be difficult for them to appreciate what the relationship truly means. When the empath is present, their support can become something the avoidant unconsciously assumes will always be there. The empath's patience, understanding, and willingness to give second chances create a sense of emotional security that the avoidant may not fully acknowledge. Because the empath continues to show care, despite periods of distance or inconsistency, the avoidant rarely has to confront the possibility of losing that connection. As a result, they often underestimate its importance. Everything changes when the distance becomes real. Once the empath steps away, the emotional noise begins to fade. The avoidant is no longer reacting to the pressure of closeness or the fear of vulnerability. Instead, they are left alone with the reality of absence. The messages stop. The emotional support is no longer available. The understanding they once received without judgment is gone. And for the first time, they experience what life feels like without the person who quietly brought warmth and stability into their world. Distance has a way of revealing truths that fear once concealed. The avoidant begins to remember the small acts of kindness, the conversations that brought comfort, and the feeling of being accepted despite their flaws. They realize that the empath offered something increasingly rare, a genuine connection that was not based on perfection, performance, or conditions. This realization can be deeply unsettling. The avoidant may recognize that they spent so much energy protecting themselves from potential pain that they overlooked the value of what they already had. The very space they once fought for can begin to feel empty. The freedom they believed would bring relief may instead bring reflection. Of course, not every avoidant immediately reaches this awareness. Some take months or even years to fully understand what the relationship meant. But time and distance often create the clarity that emotional avoidance once blocked. Without the fear that accompanied intimacy, they can finally see the relationship more objectively. Sometimes it is only after someone is gone that the avoidant realizes they were not escaping the wrong person. They were escaping emotions they did not yet know how to face. And in that realization, they finally understand the true value of the empath they once rejected. There are many people who enter our lives, but only a few leave a lasting imprint on our hearts. For an avoidant, the empath often becomes one of those unforgettable people. Not because the empath is perfect, and not because the relationship was without challenges, but because genuine emotional care has a way of reaching places that logic cannot. Long after conversations have ended and paths have separated, the memory of someone who offered authentic understanding can remain remarkably difficult to erase. Empaths bring something unique into relationships. They do not simply listen to words, they try to understand feelings. They look beyond behaviors and attempt to see the person beneath the surface. When an avoidant withdraws, becomes distant, or struggles to express emotions, the empath often responds with patience rather than immediate judgment. This ability to see beyond defensive walls creates an experience that many avoidants rarely encounter elsewhere. At the time, the avoidant may not fully appreciate the significance of this connection. Their fear of vulnerability can prevent them from acknowledging how deeply the empath's presence affects them. They may focus on maintaining distance, protecting their independence, or convincing themselves that they do not need anyone. Yet emotional experiences do not simply disappear because they are ignored. They remain stored in memory, influencing thoughts and feelings long after the relationship ends. As time passes, the avoidant often discovers that not every connection feels the same. They may meet new people, engage in new relationships, and continue moving forward with life. But they begin to notice that the emotional depth they once experienced is not easily replaced. The empath's kindness, patience, and willingness to understand them created a standard against which future relationships are often measured. What makes the empath unforgettable is not grand gestures or dramatic moments. It is the consistent feeling of being accepted. It is the memory of someone who offered support during difficult times, who believed in them when they struggled, and who created a space where they could be themselves without fear of constant criticism. Those experiences leave a lasting emotional mark. Even avoidants who rarely express regret can find themselves thinking about the empath years later. Certain memories resurface unexpectedly. A familiar place, a meaningful conversation, or a moment of loneliness can bring back the realization of what that connection represented. They remember how the empath made them feel, rather than simply what the empath did. That is the power of genuine compassion. It creates an emotional imprint that survives distance, time, and separation. While people may forget words, dates, and details, they rarely forget how someone made them feel. And for many avoidants, the empath becomes unforgettable because they offered something that could not be easily found again. A rare combination of understanding, acceptance, and unconditional care. One of the most powerful truths about human relationships is that people can change. The person who once ran from closeness is not necessarily the same person years later. Life has a way of teaching lessons that cannot be learned through advice alone. Experiences, losses, mistakes, and moments of self-reflection often become the catalysts for personal growth. For many avoidants, this growth eventually leads them to see their past relationships through a completely different lens. When avoidants are caught in patterns of emotional avoidance, much of their behavior is driven by self-protection. They focus on maintaining control, preserving independence, and avoiding situations that make them feel vulnerable. During this stage of life, they may struggle to recognize the difference between genuine danger and emotional intimacy. As a result, they can push away people who care deeply about them, believing they are protecting themselves when they are actually limiting their own capacity for connection. Growth begins when self-awareness enters the picture. Perhaps a failed relationship forces them to examine their behavior. Perhaps loneliness becomes impossible to ignore. Perhaps they encounter situations that reveal how much fear has influenced their decisions. Whatever the reason, there comes a moment when they begin asking difficult questions. Why do meaningful relationships keep slipping away? Why does closeness feel uncomfortable? Why do they pull back when someone genuinely cares? These questions often lead to deeper understanding. The avoidant starts recognizing patterns they once ignored. They see how fear shaped their choices, how emotional walls kept others at a distance, and how opportunities for love were sometimes rejected not because they lacked value, but because they felt too important. This realization can be both painful and enlightening. As emotional maturity develops, their perspective on the empath often changes dramatically. Looking back, they begin to see qualities they once overlooked. They recognize the patience that was shown during difficult moments. They appreciate the understanding that was offered without conditions. They realize that the empath's efforts were not signs of weakness, but expressions of genuine care and emotional strength. What once felt overwhelming may now appear incredibly valuable. The support they resisted becomes something they wish they had embraced. The connection they questioned becomes one they understand more clearly. With greater emotional awareness, they finally see what the relationship truly represented. This does not mean every avoidant seeks reconciliation or attempts to return. Sometimes growth simply brings understanding. Sometimes it brings gratitude, regret, or acceptance. But in many cases, maturity allows them to acknowledge a truth they could not see before. They were not rejecting someone because that person was wrong for them. They were rejecting a level of emotional intimacy they were not yet prepared to receive. Growth changes perspective because it replaces fear with understanding. And when that happens, the avoidant often discovers that the person they once pushed away may have been offering exactly the kind of love they needed all along. At the heart of every avoidant struggle is a battle between two powerful forces: the desire for connection and the fear of intimacy. These forces often exist side by side, pulling in opposite directions. One part of them longs to be understood, accepted, and loved. Another part urges caution, warning them that emotional closeness could lead to disappointment, loss, or pain. For a long time, fear tends to win that battle. It shapes decisions, creates distance, and prevents relationships from reaching their full potential. But when fear begins to lose its grip, something remarkable happens. Love finally has room to grow. Fear has a way of distorting reality. It convinces people that vulnerability is weakness, that dependence is dangerous, and that emotional walls provide safety. For avoidants, these beliefs can become deeply rooted over time. They learn to rely on themselves, suppress difficult emotions, and avoid situations that require complete emotional openness. While these strategies may offer temporary protection, they also create barriers that block meaningful connection. The challenge is that genuine love cannot thrive behind walls built from fear. Love requires honesty. It requires trust. It requires the courage to be seen for who you truly are. As long as fear remains in control, relationships often feel threatening rather than fulfilling. The avoidant may continue running from closeness, not because they do not want love, but because they are afraid of what love asks of them. Transformation begins when they start confronting those fears instead of obeying them. This process is rarely easy. It often involves self-reflection, emotional growth, and a willingness to examine old wounds. The avoidant gradually learns that vulnerability is not the enemy. They discover that opening their heart does not automatically lead to rejection. They begin to understand that true strength is not found in emotional distance, but in the courage to connect despite uncertainty. As fear loses its power, their perception of relationships changes. What once felt suffocating begins to feel supportive. What once seemed risky begins to feel meaningful. They no longer view intimacy as a threat to their independence. Instead, they recognize it as an opportunity for deeper connection and personal growth. This is often when their feelings for the empath become fully clear. Without fear constantly interfering, they can finally appreciate the love, patience, and understanding that were offered to them. The emotional connection they once resisted now feels valuable rather than frightening. The greatest lesson is that love does not disappear when fear is present. It simply struggles to be expressed. But when fear no longer controls every decision, the heart gains the freedom to speak. And in that freedom, the avoidant often discovers what was there all along: a genuine capacity to love deeply, connect authentically, and embrace the very intimacy they once spent so much time trying to avoid.